Perhaps just a little bit of background as to why this conversation takes place, why we care about personalisation and privacy, a little bit of context. So in the first half of 2019, 9.1 billion records were breached, where people's personal information went out into the market. 150 US medical organisations are currently under investigation for breach. So that's the context about why the personalisation privacy conversation has started. It's because our information is being shared more frequently, more openly and more willingly, and the issue behind that is actually creating a secondary factor. Information's about context, so whether we care whether that information's breached or shared, or whether we care whether it's personalised, is about context. I absolutely want my medical records to be held quietly, privately, and not shared with anybody other than people who are treating me. I'm a little less concerned about my financial records, and I probably don't care very much about my home address. So it's personalisation versus privacy is very much about context and the characterizations of what we do with that information. So, to start with, if you were asked to hand over your email address in return for a free pizza or a discount on your daily coffee, would you do it? Hands up? Cool. Probably so would I. How often when you're reading on a website, how often do you just click agree to the cookies just to get through because it's not it's not worth the hassle of being resisted? And all of that is sharing information. So that information is traveling down the chain and it's being used by ad companies and a whole range of other companies to personalize the experience that we're getting online. But it can go too far. So if we look at Mattel's example here with Hello Barbie, which was picking up children's voices, sending it up to the cloud to improve the personalised experience of the child as it interacted with that toy. We'd say, well, okay, well the child probably doesn't care. But actually, personally, I think that's just a little bit freaky, because we don't know where that information is being shared or what's happening to it after that. So the disclosure of what's happening with that information becomes increasingly important. And this has become the privacy paradox, the inconsistency between what we want from sharing our information versus what it's actually going to be used for. And that's becoming an increasingly complex issue as we seek greater personalisation and hyper-personalisation to improve the products we buy, the experience we have, and actually just frankly to make all of our busier lives simpler. So it changed. So it changed with the GDPR. Now the GDPR was just something, it was a piece of legislation, but the reality was what it did was it created a new baseline. And it made most of us, just simply purely because of the publicity, more aware of the fact that our information was being used and shared out there. I don't know about you guys, but actually I hadn't taken a whole lot of notice prior to that. I sort of knew my information was being shared, but I actually hadn't taken too much notice about where it was being shared or what it was being used for. But it's also interesting because as we've become more technology literate and we move through to the current generation of digital natives, we've become increasingly willing to share our information. And you can see up here in this group 60 to 64, we're only 31% of us are willing to share our information. And I fall into that category. And at the other end of the scale, we've graduated to now where people 18 to 24 are 51% are willing to share their information. But in fact, actually, I think you'll probably find it's actually higher than that because we are now much more digitally literate. We use our phones more, they're part of our life, they're part of the always-on type environment that we're actually in. Cookie breaches, even Brexit, sit there every day in the news reminding us of the fact that we've got data out there, increasingly people are using it, and increasingly people are stealing it, and increasingly people actually want to take advantage of it. We've got the latest reminder of that, which is the California Consumer Privacy Act. Now, what the Act is or isn't doesn't particularly matter. What matters is the fact it's now been adopted by 5 states in the US and is gradually going to roll out across the US, and is going to affect how consumer information is actually being shared. So we're seeing a greater legislative environment which is controlling how our information is shared. The thing that's in there though is unfortunately we haven't asked the population about how they want their information shared or used. So what we now have is a regulatory environment that many of us just in our daily lives are starting to circumvent. As we look at Generation Z and the digital natives, what we find is that these guys are more aware of their privacy, but trust has become an increasing factor in it. So they maintain their privacy settings on their phones by individual application, far better than, for example, I do. It's not something that I can be bothered doing, is going and setting up the different privacy settings in the apps on my phones. But it's probably something each one of us should be considering and doing. If we take that a little bit further and we expand on the privacy paradox, we can see here where purple is the millennials, Generation X's, and our baby boomers. We can see this trend in terms of increased willingness to share information in order to save time, in order to get a more personalised service, in order to get a faster service, a better product range. And part of that has been reflected by technology changes, which has actually allowed us to move much, much more online than we were previously able to do before. So it's not the fact that anybody made a different decision, it's the fact we changed the context around the access to information, we changed the context around our ability to get information, and we changed the way that we now interact. So, for example, we now buy 4 times as many products online as we did 2 years ago. But what we've also got to is very much because of social media, we spend a lot of time now documenting our lives. If you look at the amount of information that goes through Facebook, Twitter, and the other various social media platforms, we're communicating with each other through those platforms far more than we ever used to. Face-to-face meetings become a rarity. We do much more by teleconference, by video conference. We do much more by Snapchat. This morning I'm running a project in a large bank, and I'm actually communicating with my entire team in that bank this morning via Snapchat or WhatsApp. It's the easiest way to actually bring them all together. So we've got tools now that we didn't have 5 years ago, which has changed that underlying behaviour. All of that is cultural. If we look at the fact that our phones are now so much more enabled, we spend our lives on our phones. And it's interesting, I get up in the morning and the first thing I do is check my phone. I go to bed at night and the last thing I do is check my phone. I put it down over there and I'm already wondering what's actually come through on it since I've been standing up here. It's become part of our always-on life. The impact of that is trust. And so this is a McKinsey equation on trust. So the value of actually that always-on environment, the value of sharing my information, the value of actually having that greater personalisation is actually driven by its relevance and timeliness over the risk I feel about having lost that information. And that equates to trust. And trust has become a dialogue. Trust has become something that changes based on circumstances. We gain trust, we lose trust. It's not a commodity, but it is something that is affected multiple times throughout the relationship that we have with the organisations that we actually deal with. And I'll give you an example in terms of context. If I get out of a lift and I see £100 lying on the ground, some of us would pick it up, take it in, hand it to reception. Others would pick it up and put it in their pocket. Okay, so that's a question of standards, context, and ethics, and do the people around me, what do they trust in my terms of my behaviour? But in fact, if I now tell you that lift lobby is surrounded by glass, and there are 60 people inside that happen to be facing the lift lobby and they're working, all of a sudden the question isn't about morals, ethics, and trust. It's actually about appetite for risk. Am I willing to risk that those people will see me pick that up and put it in my pocket, and it will affect their perception? And so the whole question of context becomes important. The fact that I'm no longer in a concealed environment where nobody can see me versus I'm now in a glass environment where everybody can see me, applied context to that environment. And so trust is also about context. So do I have to trust my doctor? Absolutely. Do I have to trust my financial advisor? Less so. Do I have to trust the guy in the coffee shop down the road that he's going to make my cappuccino correctly? No, that's just hope. This was a recent survey done by PwC that in our personalisation environment, 83% of us require trust in that as a part of that relationship. 83% of consumers are willing to share their data to enable that personalised experience. But what we also find is that it is directly affected by the change in what our different generations have had available for us to actually access. In terms of the underlying technology that supported each of those generations, the ability for us to create that trust at a commercial level and at a business relationship level has changed because we interact differently. What point does personalisation become creepy? If I go to my coffee shop and the barista behind there says, "Mr. Currie, would you like cream with your coffee?" Okay, that's not creepy. I can assume that I go to the coffee shop every day. He's made my coffee multiple times, and I'm quite comfortable with that. If I go to a Pret over the road that I've never been to before, and the lady behind the counter says, "Do you want the crisps to go with that sandwich?" Because that's what you normally have, then I'm going to be seriously creepy. The fact that it was done by a facial recognition and my buying power from the Pret that I normally go to, and this person happens to have access to it, it's personalisation, but it's not comfortable because it's out of context, it's out of my known realm of environment. So in all of this, when personalisation crosses to an area where context isn't something we're comfortable with, we cease to be comfortable with that, and our trust actually becomes suspect. Our trust actually becomes at risk in terms of our relationship with that provider, and we think about whether we would do that again. If we look at the recent issue around Charing Cross, where where one of the providers there was capturing facial recognition images of all of the people going through as a part of their security aspect. The fact, that it wasn't declared, the fact that nobody knew about it, the fact that nobody knew what it was being used for, created a question of trust and a question of distrust, I guess, to say, okay, well, why are they holding this information on me? And that's creepy. In contrast, South Wales Police capturing facial recognition to ensure that there are no criminals around there actually going to cause any harm or put my life at risk, I'm completely comfortable with that. And again, that's about context because educationally wise, I've been educated that the police are a safe body. Facial recognition in King's Cross, I have no idea who they are. The same applies as we move into the commercial world and as we start to look at the characteristics and demographics of the people that we actually work with. So in that environment, consumer trust is precious and fragile, and it's easily broken. When my data is breached from an organisation, my trust is actually broken. But interesting enough, when British Airways was hacked and 380,000 records were lost, the fact that within an hour I had an email from British Airways saying they were aware they'd been hacked, they were aware my information was included, but they would underwrite any risk or cost to me, actually replaced the trust that I'd lost in that instant. The fact that an hour after that I got an email from American Express saying, "You've heard from British Airways, anything that they don't cover we will cover as a part of your American Express membership," meant that in fact my trust was restored in both organisations, and actually I stopped to worry about what was happening post that process. So context and behaviour around that is increasingly important. In our commercial environment, and this is an example of how trust and commercial opportunity relate, is that people have characteristics. So we have, in this particular example, we have cynics who view themselves as highly ethical, but will question the ethics of everybody else. We have innocents, people who will view themselves as highly ethical, but will assume that the entity they're dealing with is the same. So at a commercial level, if I'm a business, the people who are dealing with me assume that my behaviour will be identical to theirs. Opportunists will look at the different ethical behaviour of different organisations and reflect that different ethical behaviour, and actually and whether they trust them or not based on how they're acting within the context of what they're actually doing. And loyalists tend to build up a relationship with an organisation based on experience and a belief that the ethics of the organisation matches the ethics of themselves. Now, in this environment, our primary revenue opportunity is to shift our opportunists to become loyalists, because they have high value, high spend, and they can be and we can develop trust with them. In the same way, what we're doing is we're looking as individuals and reflecting our behaviour on the organisation, and reflecting within the organisation that behaviour is governed, controlled, managed, and suits my particular environment. The key to that is why, as companies within our governance and our corporate cultures, why do we expect people to behave differently? So as generations have changed, as technology has changed, we need to reflect those behaviours within our organisations. And one of the challenges in the governance environment is data governance has been around for a long time. We've been doing it for a long time, and in many cases it now needs to catch up, because the current generation entering the workforce behaves differently to the people, in most cases, who put those data governance practices in place. So our data governance needs to recognise that the current generation entering the workforce consumes information differently to what my generation did, communicates information differently to what my generation did, uses different tools. And actually, we need to recognise that in our governance practices as they come on board and into our organisations. And our governance practices need to reflect those behaviours. They also need to reflect the behaviours that we deal with multiple generations. And so a single method of communication is also not appropriate. We need multiple channels of communication and multiple channels within our organisation to allow that governance to be deployed. And that's about trust. That's about the people that we deal with trusting that we recognise the way in which they operate and the way in which they work. It applies to everything. It applies to our cyber culture, our data culture, our corporate culture, and we need to recognise that culture isn't one element. It's one thing that has different components, and as we seek to change governance, we need to change culture. So, in summary, we need to amend our governance to cater for this new environment, and it needs to be conscious. The introduction of governance into data and into that environment is a journey. It's something that happens over time and needs to be transitionary. It's not something that we can run a project and put a data governance process in place. It needs to reflect the change in organisational behaviours. Just in closing, this is Crowe's data journey. We start by looking and identifying what is the data that actually organisations need, want, and will need in 5 years' time. We look at what do we have to do for that to make it fit for purpose? How do we actually take it, use it, and prepare it for contextually the environment that we're actually in today? Then what insights can we actually draw from that? So what information can we find out? What's it actually telling us? What actions do we take from that information that we're actually being told and what we're doing and how it's using? And then how do we embed that in our business? Now, underlying all of that is our governance, culture and ethics frameworks. And all of that needs to reflect that question of personalisation versus privacy. What is too much personalisation? And recognise that the regulators have a legal requirement to do it, but in fact within an organisation it's our environment that we own, create, and the regulator is there to ensure that we actually have a sufficient level of responsibility within the organisation. If you're interested, that is a link to a white paper that I wrote a few months ago based on privacy, trust and ethics. And it looks not just at the cultural aspects of it, it looks at the GDPR impact of it, it looks at the impact of AI and machine learning initiatives in relation to this whole conversation. You're more than welcome to pick it up and download it. So thank you very much for your time. If there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to take them. Up to you.